Well, I want to welcome you again to another episode of our discussion on the a kind of a Christian understanding and view and perspective and regarding the war on Gaza. And I want to kind of lay it out there at the beginning today. Again, we named this ministry Determined Truth a number of years ago, not because we believe we have determined the truth, but because our goal really is to determine what the truth is. It's my conviction that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And that when we understand what the truth is, it helps point us to Christ. It always points us to Christ. And if I am holding to something that's not the truth, it's leading me away from Christ in some way, shape, or form. And one of the things I think that's important to do in that journey of trying to discern the truth is to hear other voices and hear other things and hear other thoughts. And when it comes to Israel, Palestine, and Israel, Gaza, one of the most important things I think you can do is go find people in your community that are Jewish, or they're Palestinian, they're Arabs, Muslim, Christian, and Jew, and just go talk to them and meet them and get to know them. So today in my conversation, I'm really excited to bring on Dr. Darrell Bock to join me today. Darrell is a executive director of cultural engagement and the senior research professor of New Testament studies at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's the author of about 40 books, that's all. But he's well-regarded commentaries on the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. I think he said he's working on the commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, so we'll be interested to see when that comes out. He's done other works on historical Jesus. He's the host of the seminary's Table podcast. He was the president of the Evangelical Theological Society from 2000 to 2001. He's a consulting editor for Christianity Today. He serves on the boards of Wheaton College and Chosen People's Ministries. And when traveling overseas, he loves to tune into a current game involving his favorite teams from Houston. And I have a feeling, Darrell, you were a little anxious last night.
Very anxious.
Okay, I was too, because I had them in my bracket, by the way. So I was like, wait a minute, I need them. I've got them all right, for the University of Houston. But nonetheless, so his team's from Houston. Darrell's been married for over 40 years to his wife, Sally, the proud father of 2 daughters and a son, and is also a grandfather. Darrell, thank you for joining me today in this conversation.
It's my pleasure, Rob. And as people may or may not know, we've been part of a discussion group that's been discussing these issues for a long time. Right. Recent events, how can I say this? Strained us a little bit.
I would agree with that.
But we're still in there, hanging in there. Whole group, and we're all in there hanging on and clinging to each other as we discuss these issues and try and sort our way through what certainly is a long, difficult, historically tangled maze that is the Middle East.
Okay. All right. So, Darrell, what we're going to do here, and this isn't debate style or anything like that at all. And I don't want people to walk away at the end of the day going, oh, Rob or Darrell. What I want people to do is to think and to have their perspectives challenged, and then go meet people, go read, go find out more information to really help process this through. But let's begin by, giving you 3, 4, 5 minutes to kind of make an opening statement in terms of how you frame this conversation. Again, what's a Christian perspective on the war on Gaza and how you approach it? And then I'll go ahead and take 3 or 4 or 5 minutes to kind of give my position, and then we'll kind of go from there. How's that?
Okay. Well, I start theologically with the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 1-3, which God promised the seed of Abraham, which includes a collective reference to Israel. Promising them a land, a people, a land, and the idea that they would be a source of blessing to the world, and how people treated them would be important for how God treats them. That's the starting point. The second point that I would make is in the offer particularly tied to the land, because that's where this discussion really resides, is that even when Israel was disobedient, this promise, by the way, was repeated throughout the Pentateuch many times, and then it was repeated through the prophets many times. When it was repeated through the prophets, it's important to note, Israel was often in deep disobedience to God when the prophets spoke, and the prophets also always held out a hope for Israel in the future, for people of Israel turning back to God and God continuing to bless them. In themes that the Old Testament describes as the restoration. And these themes also show up in the New Testament with Jesus in a series of what I call until passages. Luke 13:34 and 35, where Jesus declares Israel's house desolate because they're rejecting him as Messiah. So I agree with you that Christ is in the middle of this conversation. but then goes on to say, until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, holding out hope that there is a future. Or later on in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, where he talks about Jerusalem being trampled over until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, which the contrast to Gentiles in Scripture is always related to Israel and the Jews. And so there's a time, I think, when Israel is looking forward to a time of restoration, the program of God. Or even Romans 9 to 11, where you have Paul holding out the possibility that because unnatural branches can be grafted into the vine, so also natural branches can be regrafted back into the vine one day when all Israel is saved. And he makes clear that he's talking about the people who have rejected Christ within his own community, his brothers and sisters in Christ who have, as brothers and sisters rather, in the Jewish faith who have rejected Christ and are looking forward to a time when they also will be restored. You also have a very important passage in Acts chapter 3 where where Peter talks about heaven holding Jesus until the times of restoration come. And those times of restoration you can read about in the prophets. And the prophets include a text like Isaiah 19 and following, where there's a discussion of a highway being built between Egypt, Jerusalem, and Assyria, or Egypt, Israel, and Assyria. And all three groups are called part of the people of God. So there is a hope for Israel as a nation amongst the nations, as God is also delivering individual people to himself through the period of restoration that is to come. So those are the theological roots for why I think, one, Israel has a right to the land as a people, and secondly, then, how to deal with the nature of how to see this conflict. I tell people that although this conversation is often framed as Israel versus the Palestinians or the Jews against the Muslims, take your pick about how you want to frame the initial frame, there are actually three parties involved. There are the Palestinians, who no doubt have suffered immensely, and for a variety of reasons that I'm sure Rob and I are going to talk about. You have Israel, but you also have Hamas and those who back Hamas in a context of a jihadist view against Israel that denies Israel's presence in the land, or the idea that Israel should have a presence in the land. That complicates everything as far as I'm concerned. And I think that when the discussion is only put in terms of two parties rather than three, that's a problem, because when you talk about going to a peace table, if one of the views is you really don't belong at this peace table, even though we're going to negotiate with you, that doesn't allow much room for establishing much peace. And we see this in the way in which Israel has been challenged repeatedly at a violent level by Hamas, and the response that Israel has made. First, they had an open relationship with the people in the region. Then they ended up having to build walls to contain the violence that came from the intifada's. And then finally, we came to a point where October 7th happened, and Israel viewed that action as a failure of the wall policy to be able to contain and simply allow Hamas to continue to exist. So Israel put on a case for going after Hamas. Now, we can discuss, and I'm sure we will, the proportionality with which this has been done and the way in which Israel has executed this. And we might even agree to some degree about the way that exercise has not been what it ought to be. But the idea that Israel has the right to defend herself and has a right to the land, those to me are givens in this conversation that need to be recognized.
Thank you, Darrell, very much. All right, so let me kind of give a couple thoughts here to frame the conversation in terms of where I come from overall. I would begin by saying that I'm not going to address the theological issues, Darrell, because I've done that on several other podcast, other live streams. And so if people want to kind of have my understanding of the framing of the theological conversation with who belongs to the land and all that kind of stuff there. I've written a book, These Brothers of Mine, and I've done live streams on that also. And I think, Darrell, you and I have had conversations along the lines a little bit in terms of my theological perspectives, and maybe they'll come back up. And by the way, also, again, Darrell has been on the Determined Truth podcast. We had him on with Dr. Gary Burge to discuss Romans 9 through 11. There's one episode where I gave my perspective of Romans 9 through 11. There's another episode where we had Darrell and Gary on to discuss Romans 9 through 11. So I want to encourage you to look at the Determined Truth podcast for that. My position has been from the beginning of this episode, really, that the church must simply always be the ones advocating for justice and peace. And that just peace is to be nonviolent. I think Jesus was really clear that all who live by the sword will die by the sword, Matthew 26, verse 52. I don't think we can resign ourselves, nor should we resign ourselves to, well, this is just what happens in war. Because in war or not war, it's simply never acceptable, in my opinion, to starve 2 million people or almost starve them to death and to bomb them incessantly when they're queuing up for food that they haven't had for many, many days. I think when our nation is complicit in the bombing of civilians and the proportionality issue, I think, Darrell, that you and I will discuss more as we proceed. I think we need to stop as the church and say, not with our tax dollars and not with our name. Now, I don't deny the fact that nations can't live by the Jesus ethic. They can't. There are times where nations have to go to war. I'm not sure this fully justifies or qualifies. That might be something that we can discuss. But I think that the idea that nations can't live by the Jesus ethic ultimately actually only reinforces my point. Nations may not follow Jesus' ethic, but we must implore them to do so regardless, because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what's in the best interest of everyone. If we love Israel, this war, I don't see how we can say that this war has been good for Israel or is actually helping Israel become more and more secure. I think that might be an interesting point for us to discuss there. I would add to that, I don't think war is Christian. I think it's the antithesis of the kingdom of God. I think in the kingdom of God, Christ and the people of God suffer violence. We don't inflict violence. And therefore, we are not to encourage others to do so. And if we do, we're undermining the very essence of the gospel. And again, I think there's a difference between urging them and saying, well, it's just or justified in this particular situation there. What I think the essence of this is that this is what the cross and the resurrection of Jesus are about. And interestingly enough, we're having this conversation during Holy Week. I think we also need to understand that war almost unilaterally benefits those in power. And it almost virtually without exception disproportionately affects the poor and the vulnerable, the very things I think that Jesus was speaking against. I think the idea of the right to self-defense actually goes both ways also. It's often asked, what else is Israel to do? I think, Darrell, you and I have had that conversation. If I can actually say, I think you've even said it, what else is Israel to do? And I think the argument is usually supported by the fact that, Israel has this right to self-defense. And I understand that. And I acknowledge Israel's right, or the right of any nation to defend itself, but I just don't think it's that simple in this particular situation. For one, I'm troubled by the fact that no one seems to ask, how should the Palestinians respond after 75 years of oppression? Or do the Palestinians have the right to defend themselves? What right does the British and the French have to take a map out and draw lines on it and establish a region without even consulting the Arabs and the Arab tribes, or even their established tribal boundaries? Darrell, in one of our conversations, one of our colleagues, Bruce Fisk, pointed out that Zev Jabotinsky, who wrote The Iron Wall in 1923, and he was an early leader of the Irgun, he said, look, the native populations always resist the colonialists. And so I think that's something that we need to bring up and say, well, I'm not justifying Hamas. By no means would I be doing that. But I think we have to understand the fact that the Palestinian plight also has been a plight of displacement, and a plight of displacement at the hands of European powers and things of that nature. Jeff Halper, who's an Israeli anthropologist and the executive director of Israelis Against Home Demolitions, and he says, all other acceptable options have been foreclosed to them. Negotiations failed. Appeals to international law have fallen on deaf ears. Even nonviolent resistance, as in the first Intifada, met with excessive military repressions. Only armed resistance appears to many Palestinians to be the only way, if not to defeat Israel, then to prevent it from completing its colonial project. Now, again, this doesn't justify terrorism, but I think it puts it in a context. Just as saying, what else can Israel do, is an attempt to put Israel's acts into a context. I think if we leave it at that, we're stuck with this intractable conflict. We're stuck with there's just no solution. And I think this is, again, where the church has to step in and advocate for peace and for justice. Now, my concern with the idea that Israel has a right and maybe a responsibility to defend itself, I'd add a couple thoughts. One is more violence is not going to be in Israel's best interest. I think Israel's putting itself in a predicament that actually is going to increase the likelihood of foreign nations oppressing it even further. I think it's not been good for Israel. And secondly, I said this back on October, I think I wrote a blog post October 7th, that evening that went live on October 9th. And I said, one of the problems with the idea that Israel has the right to defend itself and with Biden's speech on October 7th was that Israel has a history of inflicting damage on a scale that's often tenfold worse than what it actually suffered itself. And I think that this only makes things worse for Israel. So I guess I'd finish up by simply saying, I was on a call with some members of some Palestinians living in Gaza. This was a couple months ago, and he says, "You want to know what the golden ticket is to this whole solution, this whole issue?" He says, "Give us justice, and we will take care of Hamas." So I would add to this, the goal of eliminating Hamas I'm going to go back here. Sorry, Darrell. The goal of eliminating Hamas is unattainable, and we discussed that a couple times also, Darrell. Hamas is an ideology, and all I think Israel's done has made Hamas stronger. It just simply recruited more people to its cause. Many of the tens of thousands of orphans created as a result of Israel's recent campaign against Gaza are simply going to be recruited by the next generation to be the next generation of Hamas loyalists. And so I think that's kind of where I would frame the conversation there. So, Darrell, I'll give you an opportunity to respond, and we can kind of just go on to our next thought there if you want.
Yeah, I think I find it amazing that you're able to go through this and not be able to articulate clearly how October 7th as an event changed the way Israel saw the space because of what happened, and that it's the precipitation for the current situation that we find ourselves in. I still ask this one question, and it is, how is it that a movement that is committed to jihad and is committed to removing Israel, they're not committed to peace. They're committed to violence. They exercise that violence in the land of Israel on a regular basis. And Israel's just supposed to stand back and say, well, we shouldn't do anything about this. And when nations have the right of the sword, the Bible says, yes, war is a terrible thing. We shouldn't promote it. But I think you can make a case that pacifism, raw pacifism, which is what I think I was hearing from you.
No, you're not. You weren't. But go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Is not the option when it comes to nations working things out. Unfortunately, sometimes war and conflict is the result. Now, no one should rejoice in that fact. That's important to say. No one should unduly promote that fact, but they certainly should be aware that what caused this particular aspect of the history was this series of acts on October 7th, backed up by the fact that what drives that ideology that you alluded to is the idea that Israel has no right to be anywhere in the land. Now, we can go back and try and adjudicate. This is the second point I'll make.
Yeah.
We can go back and try and unwind all the history that put us here, including how we got to where we are. And we can talk about, who gets to determine the spoils of war and that kind of thing coming out of World War I. We could go over that ground. I'm not sure it's going to do us much good because we are where we are. But we do need to figure out a way to get out of what I consider to be a dual cul-de-sac that we now find ourselves in which each side is spinning in a reaction that does nothing but keep them spinning in that reaction. And determining what that's going to require and what is needed for that is an important question. And the one thing I'll put on the table is I think the situation in the Middle East would be totally different if there was a recognition that Israel had a right to be present in the Middle East where she is.
Okay, so let me kind of give one thought to that, Darrell, and then maybe we'll move on to the next point there. We can go back and forth if we want, but I don't think we want to do that the whole time. And that is, I don't think I'm not denying or undermining what happened on October 7th and how that has affected how I've referred to it as a damnable event, and it is. And I think using what might be considered profane language there is appropriate. But going back to what the comment that I made from Jeff Halper, and he says, like, what do you do when the Palestinians are sitting in the situation where they've tried for 75 years and nothing else has worked? And I know it's the idea that, well, Israel wants to make peace, and I've just said this to you before as well, that Israel's a partner for peace, but they don't have anyone to make peace with. I don't think that actually works for a couple of reasons. One is it doesn't do full justice to the fact that going back to 36, 37, 47, 48, the fact that this was their land, and who are you nations to divide up our land? So the Palestinians or the Arabs at the time were willing to make a peaceful solution, and they offered solutions to the United Nations, and the solutions, and to the British after the Peel Commission. And the solutions was, we'll give one state, we'll let the Jews that are here be part of it. That's fine. No more immigration. But we'll stop the immigration where it is, but we'll have one nation as is. When that was rejected wholesale because of the idea that, well, the Jewish people had to have a state of their own, understandably, because if they don't have a democratic system where they are in power, how are they going to make sure that pogroms and Holocaust don't happen any longer? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing I'd simply say is, I don't think we can say that Israel's the fair partner in this, that we think they are. Because if they really were brokers of peace, then why have they continuously built settlements in the West Bank? In other words, we know that part of the peace program is going to include, Jerusalem, the refugees, and that's going to have to be settled somehow, some way. But a two-state solution would be the Palestinians get a certain sector of the land. And the Palestinians like, okay, we'll go ahead and take the 67 borders. That's what's been on the table since then. But the problem with that is the 67 borders are no longer viable because there's 700,000 Israelis living in the West Bank. And you can't just do a land swap. That was viable 20 years ago when there's 250,000 Israelis living in Palestinian lands. Land swaps were doable back then, but land swaps are simply not viable any longer. You can't have a contiguously viable Palestinian state. And then if I were to add one more thing, it's not only are the settlement encroaching on Palestinian lands, but Ben Gvir's handing out weapons to the settlers who are violently inflicting violence upon the Palestinians. So I don't think it's that simple to say we have three sides. We have Israel and the Palestinians, and then there's Hamas, because I think Netanyahu's track record is not much better than Hamas. And all you have to do is look at what he's doing in Gaza, let alone the settlement thing there. So, all right.
Okay, grocery list of stuff. So let me
that's right.
Let me see if I can go into the kitchen and sort out the groceries. Okay, let's talk first about where we were in the 1930s with the offer. Okay, we're going to give you a small piece of land, but you can't have Jews come into the land that's designed for them. That's not realistic.
I don't know what you mean by designed for them. I'm sorry.
You said no more immigration.
Right. But why are you saying that the land was designed for them? That assumes that it was God's land giving to them. So, but you can't impose that upon the Muslims.
Yes. Well, that's why the theological conversation is actually important. Okay.
Right.
Okay. All right. But having said that, even saying that, let me back up and say this much: that the moment you say the Jews have a right to a land, let's not talk about its size or what's in it, but has the right to a land, to their own nation, where they can make their own laws and avoid the pogroms that you mentioned, and yet you can't immigrate into that space. You can't be a full nation that can accept people who might want to come to that land, etc. That's not a realistic proposal. I'm sorry, it's not.
Okay, let me respond to that then. Since if we're going to go through the grocery list, we'll just one thing at a time. I never said they had a right to the land. I don't have a problem with them saying that the problem becomes, and Peter Beinart wrote, who's a Jewish politicist and a phenomenal scholar, wrote an article saying no people group has an inherent right to statehood or nationhood, because the problem with that becomes a problem for whoever else is living there. So the idea that, well, the Jewish people have a right to the land, the answer becomes, well, so do the Palestinians. They have a right to the land as well. And Their answer was, we'll go ahead and make the nation as it is with the ones who are already here. That's fine. So I don't see how Israel that their right gets to supersede the right of the Palestinians or the
This is
Arabs.
why the theological discussion is important, okay? Because the right to land doesn't come as a matter of international law. The right to land comes as a result of God stewarding his creation and saying, I'm creating this place for this people.
Okay.
And so
I think that's a perfect place to stop, because I think what we've done is we've said, I've got mine, you've got yours, and there's a fundamental difference there. We're not going to solve this difference today, obviously.
Fair enough, but I'm just going to point out that is an extremely fundamental difference.
I actually think that is the fundamental difference. And I think we go back and forth on these arguments. I think that's actually the place where we end up. In other words, if you don't end up there, all we're doing is going back and forth, but it really actually revolves around that central issue. And I'm not going to address my response to your theological claims here in terms of. I will note this. I did find it interesting that you clarified the covenant, and that you equivocated. I'm going to use that word. Okay. On what I think is a fundamental response of someone that would hold to my position, that is the land and faith and holding the land is contingent upon covenant obedience. And so you kind of you've responded to that already. That there were times, yeah. So, but I think that really becomes a fundamental part of the conversation. Let me see if I can take the conversation, Darrell, to what's happened since October 7th, because I think this is one of the issues that our group began getting stressed about, right? The conversations that we had, we both noticed, and I think everyone else in the room, we were doing this mostly by email at the time, got stressed about, and that is what's happened since October 7th. First off, Israel cut off the food, the water, and the gas to the civilians in Gaza. Do you believe that Israel has, or Netanyahu, right? Because I think there's more than three people in the room, because I think you got to include Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich and those guys, his extremist party there. Do you think they went too far or have gone too far, that the suffering of the people of Gaza would you agree that there's a measure of collective punishment, the deprivation of food? I think you're probably aware that now Israel's actually forbidding food coming in because they don't want UNRWA to be distributing food because they're terrorist organization. So the United States is like, well, we'll build a pier. We got to get the food in somehow. Is this collective punishment? Is this? I know you're going to say it's not genocide, but do you think they've gone too far? How do you handle what's going on right now in Gaza?
Well, and when we were sorting through the grocery list, I was going to say, let me put some things on the table on which there might be at least not so much measure of disagreement as perhaps more agreement than we might think. So let me put those things on the table, because that I think will help this conversation. I do think, and you've heard me say this, that I think not solving the displacement problem when Israel originally became a nation is something we're still coping with. Everything that grew out of that. Okay.
The displacement of the Palestinians, is that what you mean?
Yeah, but displacement of the Palestinians. Okay, that's the first thing I want to say. Second thing that I want to say is that I have also been uncomfortable with the way in which settlements have been distributed across the country and the way that works. I don't think that contributes to peace at all. So that's the second one. The third one that I would say is the one that you brought up, which is the way in which food has been, I'll say, severely restricted in terms of its access, to the point where people are suffering on the edge of famine, et cetera. I don't think that's appropriate at all. And I heard Netanyahu try and defend this a couple of weeks ago on CNN, and I went, no, that doesn't work for me. So there is that element as well. I also think that I think there is a proportionality problem here.
Okay, good.
Whenever I mention it, however, I have to mention in good faith what I also think is going on, which is that you have, for lack of a better description, a two-level war happening. And let me explain what I mean. You have what Gaza is on the ground, and you have what Gaza is underneath the ground. Okay. And getting access to the billions of dollars that were spent to build the tunnels that allow some of the terrorism to exist is a problem in the region.
Right.
and has contributed to the problem in the region. So that's another one. And there also is the way in which embeddedness is happening.
Hmm.
I can tell you stories of people I've talked to where Hamas comes to a given location and says, we want to put weapons, et cetera, in your home. And if you refuse to do that, your home's getting burned down by Hamas. They're going to insist that they have the right to take over. So who's occupying whom
Okay.
might be a question at that level. So all these lists. Now, all that I'm doing in maybe not sorting it. Maybe the groceries get sorted out, but they go into two different cabins. Okay,
Okay.
Is trying to show how complicated all this is.
Yes, I
The
agree.
conversation that we're actually having, and the fact that almost anywhere you turn, there is an argument, and then there is a sub argument that complicates it
Hmm.
to one degree or another.
Agreed.
And then we can describe how much of a degree that is. You know, your reaction to how Israel should respond to October 7th. I find myself going, well, what else are they supposed to do? They just to continue to absorb these attacks? I mean, that's the response that comes there. So that's my grocery list. I'm not sure whether they got them out of the bags or not, but I tried to make an effort to
Well,
do so.
I think some went into my cupboard and some might be in your cupboard. Um, I understand. Let me kind of just respond to that last thing there. Maybe we'll move on to the next question. That is, I understand the idea. What else is Israel supposed to do? And my answer to you, and I said this to you before, I think when we were in San Antonio, was it San Antonio this year? What
Yeah.
was try diplomacy, try peace. I don't think that Israel's actually really been a fair player in diplomacy. We know that violence isn't working and violence is creating more violence. Let's try to find a viable solution. Let's make it happen. I think you and I probably would agree on this one here. We'll put some groceries maybe in your home. I think that is that the United States has actually been just as much a problem to bringing a peaceful solution as anything else, because the United States has simply acquiesced to, I don't know if you'd agree with this part of it, but to the Israel lobby, knowing how powerful it is, and hasn't pushed Israel to do what really needs to be done, and that is force them to make a viable solution for both parties. So I think both parties are looking at this going, well, we have no other solution except violence. And again, that's where I think the church needs to be going. Violence is not going to work. It's not going to solve this. And I mean, we can discuss this now at the end, maybe at the end. Stop it, Becky, here. Sorry about that. And that is, I think it's gone so far. I don't know that diplomacy is going to work anymore. I mean, I think we may have passed the point where diplomacy would actually have worked. So, all right. So,
Yeah, and again, really short response.
please.
And that is Israel's position was we didn't do anything conscious to precipitate October 7th. Okay. That was a level of attack with a level of hostility
Yeah.
that's why that, from an Israeli point of view, that's why that attack changed the equation for them. It represented for them a failure of their wall policy, which we could talk. You know, we could revel this backward,
Sure, exactly.
run this backwards endlessly.
Right.
But that, to them, that was the failure of that showed the failure of the wall policy that they had, which was a form of their trying to contain the situation without getting into an excessively violent situation.
But
So,
would you say, though, that the response of the violence against Gaza since October 8th is only going to precipitate another? In other words, I don't agree that we could say that October 7th was up too above too far. I'm not sure how exactly to rephrase what you just said, but I think if something happened today with another attack, Hezbollah or I think Israel. I think we have to look and go, well, that's when you do what you do to the people of Gaza, displace almost 2 million people, starve, put on famine concerns, 500,000 to 1 million people, children. I don't know if you saw the video of a child up on the tower, on the electrical tower, saying, I just want to die. Dad's like, what are you doing up there? And the kid says, I just want to die. You know, and I put on my Facebook page just yesterday, Darrell, two little children, one maybe 2 years old, one maybe 3, and they're sitting on the house and they're literally shaking. They cannot stop shaking because their trauma is so intense.
Think about this. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The other half of that equation is everything that happened on October 7th and what was done to people. So, one of the things that's happening here is we've got the same stories coming from each side, and each side switches who wears the white and the black hats. Okay. So that and I'm not even disagreeing with you that we've got to figure out some way to try and unwind the cycle of the dual cul-de-sac. If I can go back to my figure, that I find that I think we're in with this.
Okay.
I think there has to be a way of thinking through that. But all that I'm saying is, I think the wild card in this that is underestimated by those who defend the Palestinian cause is the role of Hamas as an agitator in the region.
Okay, and
And
can I push back and say, but can't we say, I don't think there's three players. I think I understand what you're saying, and you wanted Hamas to be a separate player, but you've got to put Ben Gvir, you've got to put maybe even Netanyahu, you've got to put the radical right ideological settlers as another part of this equation that have been inhibitors to a peaceful resolution and a peaceful solution.
and my response to that is that if you think of Israel as a whole and all Israelis, they are not represented simply by that group, even though that group is politically in power right now. So there's a potential, or there was a potential within Israel to have other voices that were thinking about other ways to deal with this and to cope with what is going on. And unfortunately, what the attack of October 7th did, in case you haven't been, and you've been listening to me, but in case you haven't heard the undertone of what I'm saying is, it's made Israel more radical in its response.
Right.
Okay, because we're in this dual cul-de-sac in which violence is begetting violence coming from each side.
Okay, but
Okay,
don't you think that's also fair to say that the same thing has happened to the Palestinians? Their violence has been because of the cycle of violence against them. And I don't know if you're aware of this.
I'm not denying that. Okay, I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that they each are playing off of the wounding they have done to each other. Okay,
exactly.
let me say it that way. Okay,
Right.
and that wounding is deep, but the point I'm making about Hamas, and I'm not going to let you minimize this. Okay,
Okay.
this
All
may
right.
be, if you said there was one fundamental difference, this may be the second one that's really
Okay.
important,
All right.
and that is that it's not just Hamas, but what stands behind Hamas, what supports Hamas. And I'm not talking about other Palestinians. I'm talking about international support coming from elsewhere.
Okay.
What drives that is the idea that you, Israel, don't even have a right to be where you are. And that is a problem if you're going to come to a peace table. I'm sorry, it is.
I'm not going to deny that. I don't think I have denied that. I'm not going to deny that. I think the question has to come from a international law perspective, and I know you want to drive this back to the theology. As soon as I do this, it becomes, but what right does it have to be that it has to be that land, especially when, and again, just putting ourselves in the Palestinians' shoes for a moment, they're not going to come from a Christian perspective and a biblical perspective saying that the God covenantally gave them this land. They're not going to buy that argument. So because of that, they're like, hey, wait a minute. You're saying, Darrell, that Hamas has this ideology that's driving it that fundamentally says you don't have the right to exist. And the Palestinians are looking at this going, you have a Zionist ideology that says we don't have a right to exist in this land either. You ethnically cleansed us, whether you'll agree to that or not, in 48 and following. You know, I don't know, and this was the thing I was going to add, Darrell. I just found this out.
Say one word, exaggeration, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, exaggerate again. Ilan Pappé, who's an Israeli historian, and he's not alone. And actually, and I won't mention names because I don't want to do that here. But people within our group, actually, that are more on the Zionist side, Gerald, have actually affirmed that ethnic cleansing was the appropriate term as well. So, but I just learned this 2 days ago, and that is that the kibbutzim outside of Gaza that were torched and kidnapped and slaughtered and many of the people, just the horrible things that happened, that much of that land was actually in May 14th, 1948, if I'm not mistaken, it was order number 40 of the Israeli government, was to go burn the Palestinian villages on that land to the ground. The inhabitants of that land were then driven into what is now Gaza. There are members of the family who owned that land in 1940 that are 80 years old and still alive. And so you talk about the trauma of what happens. Now, this kind of goes to the theological question, because pushing it back to that, because that land actually was never, Gaza was never part of covenantal Israel, even if it was supposed to be. They actually never controlled it. So the idea, they're just retaking land that they had back 1900 years ago and returning to that land. They actually, the Philistines controlled that land during the time of David. Israel only had control of that land during the brief period of the Hasmoneans, but it wasn't the Israel, the national Israel that had that land. So the idea of like, well, if we uproot you from the land, then we have the right to go back to that land. And I think that'd be an interesting international law question. So I think it's this trauma of cycle that's on both sides of the equation, and I don't think I'm trying to minimize it on there. Maybe if you think I am, that'd be interesting to see. But I wonder if you're minimizing it on the other side as well, and how destructive this war on Gaza is currently. I just don't see how that's ever going to get through and change the mindset of Hamas to where they're going to actually go ahead and say, okay, great. You know what? We've done enough. Let's shake hands on this and see if we can put bygones be bygones.
Well, I
think Israel's made that worse.
Two sets of responses. One is, first, we can discuss what the size of the land should be. I mean, that's a discussion we should talk about. I think all that I'm trying to discuss right now is Israel is in the Middle East as a recognized nation by international law. This is when you said I don't want to have anything to do with international law. Actually, I do.
Okay. All right.
Okay. By international law, she should have the right to exist in peace amongst her neighbors, as any nation would hope to expect. Okay. That's point one.
I'll grant you that.
Point, okay. The second point that I would make is this, that as we talk about whose land, well, let me go back to the displacement, because the displacement, as I said, I think we actually agree about this. Okay, and that is that the failure to deal with displacement as Israel was established as a nation is still something we are dealing with.
Sure.
It never was adequately dealt with. It produced a lot of the life situations that Palestinians have had to suffer through. And it is a live problem in the region with a rich history. I think we agree on that.
It's a living and again, you're using the word displacement. And I think many of our viewers might be used to the word, like we're talking about the refugees in particular. So just want to make sure.
Right. Fair enough. And so I think that's an issue that's never been totally resolved, and it's part of what has allowed the festering of what took place. Totally agree with that. My own view is, I'll just talk about what my own personal view is theologically as I think about this. I think that Israel has the right, as a country that has access to land, to say, we have the right to trade. I mean, Bruce Fisk mentioned this in the piece that he's writing for us. Has the right to trade land for peace if she wants to do so at an international law level. This is why international law can help us. Okay, I think she has the right to do that. So I'm against expanding the claim of land beyond where it is right now, in part for those very reasons. It's something that should be sorted out and negotiated out diplomatically, which is what you were asking for earlier, as a way of trying to see if there's a way to sort this out. And then the next question is, how do you get, and we haven't talked about this at all, but I think this is an important part of the equation. How do we get to some form of, how can I say this, national recognition and national autonomy for Palestinians in the region, which I also think needs to be sorted through. That's if you're going to have a peace talk and a discussion, that's got to be on the agenda in one way or another. So for me, those are the outstanding. If we're going to talk about, let's pursue this diplomatically, which I think eventually, unless you want this perpetuating cycle to continue, you're going to have to get to this stage in one way or another for however it happens. at some point, those are going to be the issues that have to be dealt with. The easing the burden of the nature of the displacement, getting again. Let me put it so that both sides get dealt with. Easing the burden of what people have experienced because of displacement, figuring out how the Palestinians get a place that is theirs, if I can say it that way,
Oh, yeah.
a viable place that is
Okay.
theirs. Let me add that element to it. Um, Getting a recognition from those nations that up to this point haven't said so, that Israel, in whatever form and land she has when this gets negotiated, has the right to exist and exist in a peaceful environment. At least those three things have to be on whatever a diplomatic agenda gets put together to try and get us out of where we are. I don't know
Yeah.
what else needs to go, but those three at least.
Well, obviously, there's still, I mean, there are the issues of Jerusalem, of course, as a shared capital is one of the issues that's been on the table. But I agree with you. I think we pretty much agree on a lot of things here. But I want to push back on you keep pushing Hamas, and let me keep pushing now the right-wing ideological Zionist movement of Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir, that many Palestinians believe is actually just an unfolding of the Zionist agenda all along. Because if you go back to the Zebatinsky, if you go
That's too
back to
simple.
again,
That's too
you go.
simple.
No, wait a second. What I'm
Okay.
saying is the
Okay.
thinking that their mindset. What is their mindset? Their mindset is the early Zionists wanted to colonize all the land, and they knew that they had to displace the locals. Whether that's true or not, that was their mindset. Then you come along 67, and Israel takes more land. They
Wait
annex
a minute.
East.
Why did Israel take more land?
No. I'm saying put yourself in the context of the Palestinian narrative for a second. The threat of displacement from the beginning, the threat of this was going to be a wholesale displacement. That's the thinking. 1947 happens. They get even less land than they actually had in the Peel Commission. After the war is over, they get even less land. After they get 22% of their homeland. Then you have the 67 war, whether it's preemptive or not. But again, from the Palestinian narrative becomes, we lost even more land, including East Jerusalem, right? And now we're stuck in these enclaves of oppression. And then you have the inclusion of the settlements continuing to get built. And the idea that is we're both in
So
agreement of what should have happened.
where did these enclaves of oppression come from? What caused the security concerns of Israel to come into play in these parts of Palestinian presence?
Well, I think I can answer that in a way that you're not going to like. And I think it's a both and. So and the way that you're not going to like, which is the other side of the end, there is their own oppression of the Palestinians caused the Palestinians to respond with violence, and Israel responded to the violence with oppression, a wall. In other words, they didn't need the wall before that, but once you go back to the first Intifada was largely nonviolent. All right. And then I think it's Rabin or whatever was the prime minister at the time. I get them all kind of confused a little bit. And his answer was, we're going to break their arms and break their legs. We're going to force them into violence. They didn't heed the cry. I don't know, Darrell. I don't know if you watched the live stream I did with Greg Khalil or not. I know I sent that out and encouraged you guys to watch that a few times. So Greg, just to kind of put that into context, Greg was a Palestinian legal advisor. He's an American Palestinian by descent, Khalil family. From Bethlehem, Beit Sahor, and he was a legal advisor to the Palestinian authorities during the 2004-2008 timeframe when Sharon, whoever it was pulling the settlements out of Gaza. And Greg said, and he said everybody knew. In fact, the United States spent $2 billion to make sure it was actually enforced, and they brought a 4-star general over to make sure it actually happened. That if you're going to pull out of Gaza, you have to have certain things so that Gaza can survive. Otherwise, you're basically making it a prison camp. That's one of the enclaves that I'm using that word enclave for. But Israel decided to surround it by land, sea, and air. Documents have come out showing that Israel was actually counting the calories, how many calories it needs to go in to make sure we keep them alive. And Greg said he wrote in 2005, and he did. This happened in August 2005. I found an article that Greg was interviewed in the Virginia School of Law, I think in November of 2005. And Greg says, if we don't implement these things, giving them some freedom, opening up the gas thing, opening up the airport, allowing some free trade in, allowing them to fish off the shores, these things, we're going to suffocate them, and this is going to explode. He says, and we know we've got a ticking time bomb. He says, and everybody, Tony Blair, Condoleezza Rice, George, but they all knew they had a ticking time bomb. And then you fast forward 10 years, 15 years, and the United Nations says by 2020, Gaza is going to be unlivable. So that you have to include that to say, why did Gaza do what they did, Hamas do what they did on October 7th? We're both condemning it, but because they lived in a ticking time bomb with no hope at all. All right, I'll stop there.
So that's good.
Okay.
So let me give you the other half of the story. All right. The other half of the story is the reason October 7th happened is because Saudi Arabia was on the edge of recognizing Israel.
I think that is part of the equation. I agree.
Okay. I'm not leaving my core metaphor, which is we're in a dual cul-de-sac. Okay. There are things that each side is doing that create and perpetuate the problem that we find ourselves in. Okay. That's the point of that metaphor. And so for every story that you tell that gives the Palestinian side,
that's right.
There's a story that I can tell that gives the Israeli side. Okay. I think that's where we are in the geopolitical realities of what's going on. And I just think I just think what's hard about this is that, let me make one other point that I was going to make, because you talked about $2 billion coming from the U.S. So no, I don't want to make this awful, but maybe it does. And that is, there are billions of dollars coming from the Arab world that allowed Hamas to build those tunnels. Okay. So
not just to build the tunnels, but to build the weapons inside those tunnels.
All of it. I mean, I don't know what the figure's right. I've heard a figure as high as 32 or 34 billion.
I have no idea.
All right. Okay, but it's 2 billion is a pittance compared to what
the 2 billion was just to make sure that what actually was supposed to happen was supposed to happen. That's all it was. That's what the 2 billion was.
And this is why, just to try and find some point of contact here, this is why I talked about Palestinians need to have the right to a viable place to live. Okay, right. That's fair. So I think if the point of the podcast has been in the hour that we've spent together to show kind of where we are and how we each see it, I think we've represented our sides relatively fairly.
Yeah, I agree. Let me ask the question then here in the last couple of minutes, and that is, where do you think we go from here? And where do you think the church should be advocating in terms of where we go from here?
Well, I mean, obviously the church wants to get to a place where you can get to some measure of peace in the region. It's what they should be advocating for. The theme of justice cuts two ways as well. So certainly we should be trying to do that. I think we need to understand on both sides the nature of where the violence comes from and why, and do what you can to try and quell it. I still think that until you get all the players in the region to recognize that Israel has a place in the Middle East, we've got a problem.
Okay, so what players are left out of that equation?
What players are left out? Well, I think anything that supports Hamas and a jihadist take on Israel's presence is a problem in the region. That's what I'm saying.
Because I think what we've seen, and this is again why they exploded, I think, and that is because the Abraham Accords were beginning to unfold. And I think that goes back to what I would say at the bottom line is nations act in their own self-interest. They act according to their own pocketbooks and lining those in power and giving them more power. And if it's in our best interest to recognize Israel, then we'll recognize Israel. We're good. We're going to be done. That way the United States gives us that's what the nations were doing. And Hamas was going, wait a minute, you guys agreed that until this was resolved, you wouldn't make a deal with Israel. And now you're making a deal with Israel. Well, guess what? What does that leave us? And even more hopelessness. And I think that actually caused Hamas to
And
go up.
maybe
Right.
and maybe the reason some of those Arab countries were doing that is because they are uncomfortable with the jihadist Muslim
I think
agenda
that's
in the
true
Middle
also. I
East.
know Egypt does not like Hamas any bit whatsoever. I think that might be fair also. But
Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. But again, you see, they're blowing up for that cause. I just kind of lost my train of thought. But yeah, it gets down to. Let me ask you this question. That is, would you, as a leader in the church, call upon Israel to allow food into Gaza and to stop harassing the convoys that are trying to bring food into the people? I mean, would you?
yes, and
Okay, okay,
I would
good,
also call for, because this is a dual cul-de-sac,
okay,
I would also call for uh, the stopping of violence against people who try and distribute that food to those people within Gaza that's coming from some of the terrorist organizations who want to exploit the fact that the people are under a level of pressure that includes levels that are close to famine.
okay, yeah, yeah. And by the way, famine. I was starting to write about this. I haven't gotten a post out yet, but famine doesn't mean, oh, they're about to die from starvation. Famine means they're going to have lifelong physical consequences and effects, even if they survive famine. I mean, famine is not a good place to get to, even if they don't die and survive. It's horrific. Darrell, and I don't. And again, if you don't want to answer this question, I'll respect that. But do you think, and would you agree that Israel has targeted civilians at times beyond the law? I know you've said that you're uncomfortable with the proportionality, but do you see, from what you've seen, some of the evidence that Israel's targeting civilians, including reporters and members of the press and people that they defend as, well, they're Hamas operatives, but they were four men walking down a path and they were unarmed? I don't know if you saw that
If
video or not.
I again, I'm going to make a distinction here because I think it's important. I
Okay.
think there are clear cases of where it looks like civilians and journalists have been targeted,
Okay. All right.
and there's been an attempt to not pursue in a transparent way that that's taken place.
Okay.
Whether that is a national policy or not is another
Right.
question. Okay. I think you have some people caught in this fight. I think you can say this for both sides. This is
Mm-hmm.
part of what the October 7th element is as well. You've got elements in both sides that are radicalized on this question for the position that they hold, and they have done things that others of the same ethnicity would not have done.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think the United States has a bad track record on the same doing the same things that's themselves as well. Hey, we got one question that came in from one of the viewers, Darrell, and it's about the theological boundaries of Israel. But let me ask the question this way, if I can, and see what you think on that. So we kind of started with, okay, your bottom line is God's given them this land; they have this right to be there. What does that mean then, from your understanding, for the indigenous peoples? You
Who's
know,
indigenous? Who's
for
indigenous? How far back are we going to go?
1947, 1948. The Arabs that were there, what does it mean for them if Israel has this right? We need to make this nation because God gave them this land. You know, whether it's the pogroms and whether you want to include that.
I
What would you
think,
do with the
well, what
indigenous
it
people?
means, it means several things.
Okay,
Okay, it means several things. This is a fair question. Uh, First of all, that this viable place for Palestinians and Arabs needs to be found in a way in which they can pursue
okay,
life and a well-being that's important. That's the first thing to say. I think one of the failures of the displacement, and we didn't discuss this, but it's part of
okay,
the
right,
conversation of the history, is just like Europe absorbed a lot of Ukrainian refugees coming out of the war in order to deal with a global crisis,
mm-hmm.
the neighbors of Israel should do the same. They're equipped to do it. Many of those countries have the financial means to do it, et cetera. And there's a way to deal with the pressure in the region by having neighbors help out with the nature of the situation as it exists. I think that's a second feature of what needs to be taken into account as we deal with, is there a way out of this cul-de-sac that we're in?
Okay. So I want to let you know, if you've been watching us, by the way, Determined Truth has been doing a series of podcast or live streams here on the crisis in Gaza. Our next one is with Professor and Pastor Alex Awad, a Palestinian Christian. Darrell, I think you might know Alex a little bit, or at least you know of the Awad family. So
I
Alex is going to
certainly
come
do.
on
Yep.
right now. It's scheduled for April 11th at 10 p.m., 10 a.m. Pacific time. That's still tentative. I have to confirm that date, but that'll be. But if you sign up for the Determined Truth YouTube page and subscribe, you'll get automatic updates on that. I'm also doing a series right now on kind of an introduction to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I'm trying to narrate both sides, what they're both saying. Certainly, I'm giving my own slant to it and what I think, but to understand the dual narratives, we did 3 episodes last week introducing the historical context. We have another episode this Wednesday night at 5 p.m. Pacific time, where we begin to look at some of the justice issues that have arisen as a result of occupation and things of that nature. That might take 2 weeks, but if it doesn't take 2 weeks, then the following week we'll look at where do we go from here? What does peace look like? And I'll address specifically some of Darrell's statements here in terms of land and thoughts on that also. So, Darrell, anything else that you want to say here before we call it a night?
No, I think we're good. I think we've established why we have our group, and
Well, yeah. All
yeah,
right.
and why we're engaged in these discussions. And yeah, that's all. That's all I'll say.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for your time. Thank everybody for tuning in, and I appreciate everyone. Thank you very much.